The night sky over the English Channel was black as pitch, broken only by streaks of tracer fire that arced upward like the fingers of angry gods reaching for the belly of the C-47 transport plane. Inside the fuselage, the air was thick with the smell of aviation fuel, sweat, and something darker. The metallic scent of fear that no amount of bravado could completely mask. The plane bucked and shuddered as flak burst around it, orange blossoms of death blooming in the darkness, each one close enough to rattle the teeth of the men packed shoulder to shoulder in the dimly lit cargo bay. Jake McNiece sat near the jump door, his face painted in streaks of black and green, a mohawk running down the center of his shaved skull like the crest of some ancient warrior. Around him, the other men of the filthy 13 bore similar marks, war paint that spoke of defiance, of heritage, of a deliberate choice to be something other than ordinary soldiers. They looked like demons in the red glow of the cabin lights, and that was exactly the point. McNiece's jaw was set tight, his eyes hard as flint, but somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the layers of muscle and scar tissue and accumulated toughness, his heart hammered against his ribs with the primal rhythm of a man about to step into the unknown. The engines screamed. Another burst of flak struck somewhere behind them, and the plane dropped sickeningly for a moment before the pilot wrestled it level again. McNiece could hear men praying in whispers, rosaries clicking like the teeth of nervous ghosts. He didn't pray. He'd stopped believing in God somewhere between his 10th birthday and his 11th, when his father had walked out and his mother had started taking on laundry just to keep food on the table. The Great Depression had taught him that survival was something you earned with your fists and your will, not something granted by any benevolent power watching from above. The red light near the door snapped on. The jumpmaster, his face pale and glistening with sweat, began hooking static lines to the cable running the length of the fuselage. Each man checked the man in front of him, hands moving mechanically through routines drilled into them until they became reflex. McNiece felt fingers tug at his harness, checking the connections that would, God willing, keep him tethered to his parachute when he stepped into the howling void beyond that door. Then it happened. The plane lurched violently to the left as another shell burst close enough to shred metal. The sound was deafening, a shriek of tearing aluminum and explosive concussion that made McNiece's ears ring. Something struck Willie Green, the paratrooper nearest the door, and suddenly his reserve chute deployed inside the plane, white silk exploding like a malevolent jellyfish, tangling around him, around the door frame, around everything within reach. The fabric blocked the exit completely, billowing and thrashing as the wind from outside caught it. "Jesus Christ!" someone shouted, but the words were lost in the chaos. Green was fighting the chute, trying to gather it, trying to push it back, but the wind was too strong and the silk too voluminous. The plane shook again. McNiece could see the jumpmaster's eyes go wide with something beyond fear. The knowledge that if they didn't get out soon, they were all dead. The pilot couldn't hold this course forever, not with flak bursting all around them, not with fighters somewhere in the darkness looking for easy prey. McNiece shoved forward, adding his hands to Green's, both of them tearing at the silk, bundling it, shoving it aside. Green's face was twisted with effort, veins standing out on his neck, and for a moment their eyes met, a shared understanding that this moment mattered more than any other moment in their lives. If they failed here, 20 men died in a flying coffin over the French coast. If they succeeded, they had a chance. That was all it ever came down to, a chance. The silk gave way. Green ripped the last of it free and threw it behind them, clearing the door. The jumpmaster was screaming now, waving them forward, and Green didn't hesitate. He stepped into the darkness and was gone, swallowed by the night. McNiece went next, one step and then the emptiness, the sudden gut-wrenching sensation of falling, the jerk of the static line pulling his chute free, and then the blessed, terrifying silence as he floated downward through a sky lit by tracer fire and the distant glow of explosions. He looked back up just in time to see the C-47 explode. The plane came apart in a bright orange fireball that seemed to hang in the sky for an impossibly long moment, pieces of fuselage tumbling end over end, trailing smoke and flame. McNiece felt the heat wash over him even from this distance. He didn't know how many men had made it out after him. He didn't know if the rest of his unit was alive or dead, scattered across miles of enemy territory or lying broken in French fields. All he knew was that he was falling toward France, toward Germans, toward a mission that seemed impossible even when everything went according to plan, and nothing had gone according to plan. The ground rushed up to meet him. He hit harder than he expected, his knees buckling, and he rolled through the impact, came up tangled in his harness in the middle of a field that smelled of wet earth and growing things. The parachute collapsed around him like a funeral shroud. In the distance, he could hear the crump of artillery, the stutter of machine gun fire, and somewhere much closer, the sound of German voices shouting in alarm. This was Normandy. This was D-Day. This was hell. But for Jake McNiece, hell was nothing new. He'd been preparing for this his entire life. He'd been 10 years old the first time he'd understood what it meant to be poor in a way that left scars. It was 1930, and the Great Depression had settled over Oklahoma like a plague, turning fertile land to dust and prosperous towns to ghost villages where hollow-eyed men stood on corners with nothing to do but wait for something that never came. His father, a man named John McNiece who'd fought in the First War and come home with lungs scarred by mustard gas and a temperament scarred by things he'd never speak of, simply walked out one morning and didn't come back. No note. No goodbye. Just gone, as if he'd been erased from existence. Jake's mother, Sarah, was a small woman with Choctaw blood in her veins and a spine made of something stronger than steel. She took in laundry, scrubbed floors, did whatever work she could find, but it was never enough. Jake learned quickly that childhood was a luxury they couldn't afford. At 10, he was working alongside grown men, hauling water, cleaning stables, doing whatever brought in a few coins. At 12, he was lying about his age to get construction jobs. By 14, he could outwork men twice his age, and he'd developed a reputation for two things: an unwillingness to quit and an absolute refusal to back down from a fight. He got the fighting honest. Part of it was the Cherokee and Choctaw heritage from his mother's side, a legacy of people who'd been pushed and prodded and forced westward on trails that killed thousands, who'd learned that survival meant standing your ground when you had to. Part of it was just Jake. He was small for his age but dense with muscle and rage, and he'd discovered early that if you hit first and hit hard enough, size didn't matter as much as people thought. By the time he was 16, he'd been in more fistfights than he could count, and he'd won most of them. But Jake wasn't just a thug with a chip on his shoulder. He was smart, observant, and beneath the rough exterior, there was a code he lived by. You didn't steal from people who had less than you. You didn't hit women. You stood by your friends even when it cost you. And you never, ever let anyone make you feel small. Football gave him an outlet. He played for his high school team with a ferocity that bordered on suicidal, throwing himself at opponents with complete disregard for his own safety. Coaches loved him because he was fearless. Opponents hated him because he was dirty, willing to do whatever it took to win. He didn't care. On the field, the rules were simple and the objective was clear. In life, things were messy. After high school, he bounced around construction jobs, oil rigs, anything that paid. Eventually, he ended up as a firefighter in Ponca City, Oklahoma. It was good work, respectable work, the kind of job that came with a uniform and a steady paycheck and the respect of the community. It was also a draft-exempt job. When war broke out in Europe and the draft boards started calling up young men by the thousands, firefighters were considered essential personnel. Jake could have sat out the entire war in safety, battling blazes instead of Nazis. But Jake McNiece wasn't built for safety. And besides, he'd gotten himself into trouble. It was a bar fight, the kind of stupid, pointless altercation that happened when you mixed alcohol, testosterone, and old grudges. Jake didn't even remember what started it. Some comment about his heritage, maybe, or someone looking at him wrong, or just the general atmosphere of tension that hung over everything in those days. What he remembered was the feeling of his fist connecting with another man's jaw, the satisfying crunch of cartilage, and then the sudden realization that the man wasn't getting up. There was blood. There were police. There were threats of charges that could put him in prison for years. The judge gave him a choice: enlist or face prosecution. It wasn't really a choice at all. Jake signed up in 1942. He could have gone into the regular infantry, done his time, kept his head down, and survived. But that wasn't Jake's way. When he heard about the paratroopers, the new, elite airborne forces that were being trained to jump out of planes behind enemy lines, something in him responded. This was what he wanted. Not sitting in a trench waiting for orders. Not being part of some vast, impersonal machine. He wanted to be where the action was hottest, where he could look the enemy in the eye and test himself against them directly. The paratrooper training at Fort Benning, Georgia, was designed to break men. It was brutal by intention, a deliberate process of elimination that weeded out anyone who lacked the physical toughness, mental resilience, or sheer bloody-mindedness required to be an airborne soldier. Out of every 100 men who started the training, fewer than 2 finished it and earned their wings. The rest washed out, broken by the constant physical punishment, the sleep deprivation, the forced marches with full packs in the Georgia heat, and above all by the jumps themselves. The moment when you stood in the door of a moving plane and forced yourself to step into emptiness despite every instinct screaming at you to stay put. Jake thrived. The physical challenges were nothing to a man who'd been working hard labor since he was 10. The mental pressure didn't faze someone who'd grown up fighting for every scrap. And the jumps? After the first moment of terror, he discovered he loved them. The rush of adrenaline, the sensation of controlled falling, the way it made him feel alive in a way that nothing else did. But while Jake excelled at the training, he chafed constantly against military discipline. He didn't like taking orders from men he didn't respect. He didn't see the point of regulations that seemed designed only to enforce conformity. When an officer told him to do something stupid, he said it was stupid, usually loudly and profanely. He went AWOL whenever the mood struck him. He drank too much, fought too often, and accumulated disciplinary marks in his file like other men collected postage stamps. The army didn't know what to do with him. He was too good to discharge, too troublesome to promote. Eventually, someone had the bright idea of putting all the troublemakers together in one unit. If they were going to be discipline problems anyway, the reasoning went, at least make them useful. Stick them in a demolition unit where their aggression and disregard for rules could be channeled into blowing things up behind enemy lines. That's how the Filthy 13 came to be. They earned the name honestly. It started as an insult, something other soldiers called them because they were notoriously filthy. They refused to bathe, wore the same uniforms until they were stiff with dirt and sweat, and generally looked like they'd been pulled from a ditch. But Jake and the others embraced it, wore it as a badge of honor. They were the unwanted, the rejects, the men who didn't fit anywhere else. They drank like fish, fought like demons, and skipped roll calls with impunity. Commanders hated them. Other soldiers gave them a wide berth. But in combat training exercises, they were terrifyingly effective. They moved fast, hit hard, and completed objectives that other units failed at. They were creative in ways that by-the-book soldiers weren't, willing to take risks that conventional troops wouldn't consider. They functioned less like a military unit and more like a pack of wolves, each man fierce individually, but together forming something greater than the sum of its parts. Jake was their natural leader, though he held no official rank over most of them. He led by example and by the force of his personality. The others followed him because they trusted him, because he'd proven himself in 100 small ways, because when things got bad, Jake was the man you wanted at your side. The Mohawks came later, Jake's idea. He'd always been proud of his Native American heritage, even though it had caused him trouble growing up. In Oklahoma in those days, being Indian was something people used against you, a reason to pay you less or treat you as lesser. But Jake had learned to wear it as armor. When they were preparing for D-Day, he suggested they all shave their heads except for a strip down the middle and paint their faces. Make themselves look like warriors from another age. Intimidate the enemy before the first shot was even fired. The idea caught on. On the night of June 5, 1944, as the invasion fleet assembled and the paratroopers prepared for their jumps into occupied France, the Filthy 13 gathered to shave each other's heads and apply war paint. They looked like something out of a nightmare, or perhaps out of history. The ghosts of warriors from centuries past, come to haunt a modern battlefield. Photographers captured the moment, and the images would become iconic symbols of a certain kind of American soldier. Rough, irreverent, utterly dedicated when it mattered. Now Jake was on the ground in Normandy, and all that preparation, all that training, all that attitude meant exactly nothing if he couldn't survive the next few minutes. He cut himself free of his parachute harness, the knife from his boot making quick work of the straps. The chute fell away and immediately the night became clearer. He could hear better without the silk rustling around him. German voices, still distant but getting closer. The sound of boots on gravel. Somewhere to his left, the distinctive burp of an MG-42 machine gun opening up, the rate of fire so fast it sounded like cloth tearing. Jake pulled out his rifle, checked it by touch in the darkness. Everything seemed intact. He moved low across the field, heading for the darker shadow of a hedgerow that marked the field's boundary. Normandy was a patchwork of small fields bordered by these ancient hedgerows, thick tangles of earth, roots, and vegetation that rose 10 feet high and made every field a potential fortress. The Germans had been fortifying this ground for years. They knew every lane, every sight line, every good position. The paratroopers were landing blind into a landscape designed to kill them. Jake reached the hedgerow and pressed himself into it, listening. The artillery had faded somewhat. The massive naval bombardment that was supposed to be supporting the beach landings must be concentrating on the coast. Inland here, it was quieter, punctuated by bursts of small arms fire and the occasional explosion. In the distance, he could see the sky glowing orange where something large was burning. A whistle, 3 short bursts. The recognition signal. Jake froze, listening. Came again, closer this time. He clicked the cricket in his pocket twice, waited. Another click answered him. A shape materialized from the darkness. A paratrooper, moving low and fast. Jake couldn't see the face but recognized the silhouette. Chuck Plata, one of his squad. Jake! Plata's voice was barely a whisper. Yeah. You hit.
No.
Lost my rifle in the drop. Found a Kraut and took his. Jake could see now that Plata was carrying a German Mauser. His face was still painted, though the design was smeared and running with sweat. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated with adrenaline. Where the hell are we? Plata asked.
France.
Beyond that, I got no idea. They moved together along the hedgerow, looking for others. The plan, such as it was, had been to drop in tight groups, assemble quickly, and move on objectives. The reality was that the drops had been scattered across miles of countryside. Some men had landed in trees and been shot before they could cut themselves down. Others had drowned in flooded fields that weren't supposed to be flooded. Still others had landed in the middle of German positions and been killed or captured immediately. Over the next hour, Jake found 5 more men from his unit. Only 5 out of the 13 who'd been on that plane. The rest were dead, captured, or scattered so far they might as well be on another planet. The men Jake found were a rough lot even by the standards of the filthy 13. Jack Womer, who'd been a boxer before the war and still had the flattened nose to prove it. Robert Cohn, silent and efficient, the kind of man who never spoke unless he had something worth saying. John Agnew, barely 20 years old but already sporting a scar across his cheek from a training accident. Maynard Smith, who claimed to have Cherokee blood though no one quite believed him. And George Radica, who'd been a thief in civilian life and made no apologies for it. With their paint smeared and their mohawks deflated by sweat and rain, they looked less like warriors now and more like what they were. Scared, determined men a long way from home, surrounded by enemies, expected to complete a mission that seemed impossible. Jake gathered them in the relative shelter of a bombed-out barn. The roof was mostly gone, but the walls provided some concealment. He pulled out his map, which had survived the jump folded inside his jacket, and tried to orient himself by the distant glow of fires and the occasional star visible through breaks in the clouds. Best I can figure, we're about 3 miles northwest of the drop zone, he said, keeping his voice low. That puts the bridges over the Douve somewhere southeast of here. The bridges were their objective. The Douve River ran roughly parallel to the coast, and several bridges crossed it. German reinforcements would use those bridges to move troops and armor toward the invasion beaches. The paratroopers' job, the filthy 13th's job, was to destroy or capture those bridges. Blow them if possible. Hold them if not. Keep the Germans from using them to slaughter the men coming ashore. 3 miles through enemy territory, Womer said, with 6 men. 7 if we count Jake, Agnew said. It was meant as a joke, but no one laughed. We move fast, stay off the roads, and kill anyone who sees us, Jake said. Same as we trained for. Training didn't include getting scattered all over hell and gone, Radica muttered. Then we improvise. Jake folded the map and tucked it away. We got a job to do. Those boys on the beaches are counting on us. We fail, they die. Simple as that. It was simple. That was the thing Jake had always understood about war, the thing that made it both terrible and clarifying. All the complexity of normal life, the politics, the economics, the social hierarchies and moral ambiguities, boiled away, leaving only the essential question. Would you do what needed to be done, even when it was hard, even when it was frightening, even when it might kill you? Jake had been answering that question since he was 10 years old, working jobs that should have broken him, fighting fights he should have lost, surviving when survival seemed impossible. They moved out as false dawn began to gray the eastern sky. Jake took point, leading them through fields and along hedgerows, avoiding anything that looked like it might be defended. They saw Germans twice, once a patrol moving along a road, which they let pass rather than engage and reveal their position, and once a single soldier relieving himself behind a tree, who Cone killed with a knife so quietly the man didn't even cry out. The land was beautiful in a harsh way, even scarred by war as it was. The fields were green with early summer growth. Apple orchards stood in neat rows. Old stone houses with slate roofs clustered in small villages that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more, indifferent to the temporary madness of men trying to kill each other in their shadows. But Jake couldn't appreciate any of it. Every hedge could hide an ambush. Every house could contain a sniper. Every sound could be the prelude to an attack. His nerves were stretched so tight he could feel them vibrating like piano wire. They reached the river as the sun broke over the horizon. The Douve was narrower than Jake had expected, maybe 30 feet across, running dark and swift between muddy banks. Two bridges crossed it within a mile of their position, one a stone arch affair that looked medieval, the other a more modern steel structure that carried a paved road. Both bridges were defended. Jake could see German soldiers on the far side, dug into positions that commanded the approaches. Machine gun nests, mortar teams, at least a platoon's worth of men, maybe more. Can't blow them without getting closer, Walmer said, studying the bridges through a gap in the vegetation. And we can't get closer without getting dead. We take the stone bridge, Jake said. Old stone like that, we might not be able to blow it anyway. But we can clear the defenders and hold it. 6 of us against 40 of them? Agnew's voice cracked slightly. Jake looked at him, this kid who was barely old enough to shave, who'd volunteered for the hardest job in the army because he wanted to prove something to himself or to his father or to some girl back home. Jake saw himself in that kid, the same desperate need to be worthy of something, to matter. We're not regular soldiers, Jake said. We're the filthy 13. We do what can't be done. It was bravado, the kind of thing commanders said before sending men to die. But it was also true in its way. They'd been told their whole lives they weren't good enough, weren't disciplined enough, weren't worthy of respect. They'd taken that rejection and forged it into something else. A fierce pride, a determination to prove everyone wrong, a willingness to attempt the impossible just to spite the people who said they'd fail. They attacked at noon, when they figured the Germans would be tired from a sleepless night and maybe careless from the heat of the day. Jake led them across an open field in a dead run, firing from the hip, screaming like demons. The Germans were caught off guard. They'd been watching for an attack from the other direction, expecting American forces to advance from the drop zones to the west. By the time they oriented on this new threat, Jake and his men were already at the bridge. The fighting was close and brutal. Jake shot a German officer in the face at a range of 5 feet. Walmer beat another man to death with his rifle, but when his ammunition ran out. Agnew took a bullet in the shoulder but kept fighting, his blood mixing with the old war paint on his face. They cleared the near side of the bridge in 5 minutes of sustained violence that felt like hours. But the far side was still held, and the Germans were rallying. Machine gun fire raked the bridge, chewing chunks out of the stone. Jake and his men were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. They'd seized half the objective, and that was all they were going to get. "We hold here," Jake shouted over the noise. "We don't let them cross. Reinforcements will come." The reinforcements didn't come. Not that day. Not that night. Jake and his men held the bridge for 36 hours, fighting off 3 German counterattacks. running dangerously low on ammunition, surviving on whatever they could scavenge from the dead. Agnew died of blood loss sometime during the second night, slipping away quietly while Jake was too busy fighting to notice until it was too late. Radica was killed by a mortar strike that left Jake's ears ringing for hours afterward. But they held. When American forces finally reached them, regular infantry pushing inland from Omaha Beach, they found 4 men still alive, still defending their half of a bridge that had cost them everything to take. The bridge itself was barely functional, pocked with bullet holes and scorched by explosions, but it was denied to the Germans, and that was what mattered. Jake McNiece survived D-Day. He survived the entire war, in fact, though he picked up more scars and saw more friends die than any man should have to. The Filthy 13th's reputation only grew. They fought in Market Garden, in the Battle of the Bulge, everywhere the airborne went. They remained undisciplined, unruly, and absolutely lethal when it counted. After the war, Jake went home to Oklahoma. He didn't talk much about what he'd done. The medals they gave him sat in a drawer somewhere. He went back to being a firefighter, back to being ordinary, though men who'd served with him knew there was nothing ordinary about Jake McNiece. He'd been forged in the Depression, tempered in training camps, and tested in combat. He'd looked death in the eye more times than he could count, and death had blinked first. The Filthy 13 became legend. Their image, those Mohawks, that war paint, iconic symbols of a particular brand of American warrior. Rough, irreverent, brave beyond measure. They'd been the men nobody wanted, the troublemakers and rule breakers, and they'd become exactly what the moment required. Jake McNiece lived until 2013, dying at the age of 93. He'd outlived most of his unit, carried their memories with him, and never forgot what it meant to be one of the Filthy 13. In interviews late in life, when he finally consented to talk about the war, he'd speak about his men with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with glory and everything to do with the bond forged between people who've survived hell together. On that night over the English Channel, when Willie Green fought to clear the door and the plane exploded behind them, Jake McNiece had been falling into the unknown. He'd survived by being tougher, meaner, and more determined than the forces arrayed against him. But more than that, he'd survived by understanding something essential. That sometimes the misfits, the troublemakers, the men who don't quite fit, sometimes those are exactly the men you need when everything falls apart and there's no one else willing to do what must be done. The bridges over the Douve were held. The reinforcements never reached the beaches in time. Thousands of men who landed on Normandy that June morning lived because paratroopers like Jake McNiece did their job. History remembers the invasion, the great sweep of armies, the strategic genius. But history is made of moments, individual moments when individual men choose to act, to fight, to hold the line when every instinct screams at them to run. Jake McNiece and the Filthy 13 had plenty of moments like that. They'd spent their whole lives preparing for them, in ways they never fully understood until the moment arrived. And when it did, they were ready. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey with us into one of World War II's most remarkable, and often overlooked, stories. The Filthy 13 were real men who did extraordinary things, and Jake McNiece's life represents a kind of American experience we don't often talk about. The rough edges, the fighters, the men who society tried to file down but who remained defiantly themselves. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that like button to help us share these forgotten histories with more people. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What struck you most about Jake McNiece's story? Do you think his troubled youth prepared him for war, or was he simply a natural survivor? Share your interpretations, your questions, or even stories of your own family members who served. These conversations keep history alive. Thank you for watching.